Mining is more of a science than it is just digging. It's just not a matter of turning the machine on and turn the water on and start running dirt. You gotta figure it out.
Some bonds seem unbreakable, forged in the frozen Yukon mud, tempered by 14 years of impossible odds and shared victories. Chris Doumitt and Parker Schnabel weren't just miner and boss. They were brothers in the trenches, building an empire 1 ounce at a time. But even the strongest steel can shatter under enough pressure. And in season 15, that pressure finally broke what everyone thought could never be broken. What you're about to witness isn't just a workplace dispute. It's the story of how ambition devoured loyalty, how silence became louder than any explosion, and how the heart of Gold Rush was ripped out in a clash so brutal that Discovery buried the footage and tried to erase it from history. If you love uncovering the real stories behind Gold Rush, the feuds, the secrets, the moments Discovery doesn't want you to see, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe, because this is the clash that changed everything. Chris Doumitt was the cigar-smoking carpenter turned gold miner who became the soul of Parker Schnabel's operation. For more than a decade, he wasn't just another crew member. He was the glue holding the team together, the heart, the humor, the backbone of an empire built on frozen ground and impossible dreams. When machines broke down at 3 a.m. in sub-zero temperatures, it was Chris who'd be out there with a wrench and a joke, keeping spirits up when everything else was falling apart. When younger miners doubted themselves, it was Chris who reminded them why they came north in the first place. He was the balance to Parker's relentless ambition, the humanity that kept the operation from becoming just another soulless gold factory. But in season 15, something fundamental shifted in the operation that fans had watched evolve over the years. At first, the change was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention to the details. Chris, usually the life of the mine, with his infectious laughter and constant banter, went quiet. The jokes that once broke the tension of 16-hour shifts stopped coming. His trademark laughter that echoed over the roaring wash plants was gone, replaced by a silence that felt heavier than the Yukon permafrost. Crew members started noticing the absence more than the noise, exchanging worried glances when Chris walked past without his usual greetings or wisecracks. And Parker? He was too busy chasing ounces to see what that silence meant. His focus had narrowed to a single obsession: production numbers that would cement his legacy as the greatest miner of his generation. Maps covered every surface in his trailer, calculations scrawled in margins, projections that grew more ambitious with each passing week. To Parker, every distraction was a threat to the season's goals. Every moment not spent extracting gold was a moment wasted. Instead of easing the pressure when the warning signs appeared, Parker piled it on. More dirt, more hours, more risk. The wash plant that had served them reliably for years was being pushed beyond its design specifications, running shifts that equipment manufacturers would have called suicidal. Machines were breaking down left and right, bearings cooked from overuse, hydraulics failing mid-shift because preventive maintenance was sacrificed for continuous operation. Chris had the guts to say what no one else would: "If we keep working the wash plant like this, it'll kill someone before it breaks." The younger miners looked to him for guidance, trusting his decades of experience over Parker's aggressive timelines, but the warnings only fueled Parker's impatience. On camera, the growing distance between the two men became impossible to ignore. Parker hunched over maps in his trailer, scribbling numbers late into the night while the rest of camp slept. Chris stood alone by the shop, cigarette glowing in the dark like a lonely lighthouse, eyes fixed on the machines as if they were ticking time bombs waiting to explode. The cameras caught these moments, silent, separate, a visual representation of a partnership fracturing in real time. Fans saw it too, their instincts picking up on tensions that Discovery's editors tried to downplay. Reddit threads lit up with concerned observations. Why isn't Doumitt smiling anymore? Something's not right with the crew. The vibe is completely different this season. The online Gold Rush community, having watched these men for over a decade, could sense that something fundamental had broken even before the full story emerged. And they were right, because behind the scenes, the first cracks had already appeared. Hairline fractures in a foundation that everyone assumed was solid stone. The breaking point began with an impossible demand that would set everything in motion. Parker gathered the crew one morning and dropped a bomb that left even the most optimistic miners stunned. $20 million in gold this season, nearly double their most successful haul in the operation's history. No discussion, no debate, no consultation with the men who'd have to make it happen. Just pure, unadulterated ambition delivered as an order, rather than a goal. To Parker, it was about proving himself as the undisputed king of the Klondike, silencing critics who claimed his early success was just beginner's luck or his grandfather's legacy. Every ounce would be vindication. Every record broken would cement his place in mining history. The $20 million target wasn't just a number, it was a declaration of dominance that would echo through every mining camp in the Yukon. To Chris, it was insanity bordering on delusion. Years of experience told him the ground couldn't give that much. Not with the constant equipment breakdowns, not with the crew already worn thin from the relentless pace. Mining wasn't about what you demanded. It was about what the earth was willing to surrender. You could push men and machines to their limits, but geology didn't negotiate, and bedrock didn't care about your ambitions. He tried to reason with Parker, approaching him with the careful diplomacy of someone trying to talk a friend off a ledge. He reminded him that mining success came from sustainable practices, from respecting both the ground and the men. Push too hard and everything collapses: equipment, morale, and eventually the operation itself. But Parker wouldn't hear it. In his mind, Chris's caution was just fear dressed up as wisdom, hesitation masquerading as experience. Cameras caught glimpses of the growing tension. Chris shaking his head in meetings, Parker cutting him off mid-sentence with dismissive gestures. Behind the scenes, away from the microphones and documentary crews, Parker reminded Chris that investors and Discovery expected bigger numbers, bigger drama, bigger television. The show's ratings depended on escalation, on records being chased and broken. Playing it safe might keep men alive and equipment functional, but it wouldn't keep cameras rolling or contracts renewed. Among the crew, whispers spread like wildfire through dry timber. Some called it burnout season, recognizing the signs of an operation pushed past sustainable limits. Others said Parker had finally lost touch with reality, that success and television fame had transformed him from a talented young miner into something they no longer recognized. Chris confided to Mitch one night by the equipment shed, his voice low and tired. "We're not mining anymore, we're gambling." And Parker's betting with people's lives. Those words, quiet but heavy with resignation, marked the moment when the lines were truly drawn. On one side, Parker chasing legacy and numbers. On the other, Chris, standing for reason, safety, and the men who'd trusted both of them with their futures. The final catalyst came when the Yukon unleashed its fury in a storm that would test every breaking point. Yukon weather doesn't negotiate, doesn't compromise, and when it hits with the force of geological vengeance. Winds ripped through camp like invisible blades, tearing tarps from equipment and sending loose tools flying like shrapnel. Rain flooded haul roads, turning packed dirt into rivers of mud that swallowed truck tires up to their axles. Mudslides threatened the pay cut, the precious ground they'd spent weeks exposing now at risk of being buried under tons of unstable hillside. For most miners, even the ambitious and reckless ones, it would have been an automatic shutdown. You secure the equipment, protect the infrastructure, and wait for the storm to pass. Mining in these conditions wasn't just dangerous, it was suicidal, asking for catastrophic equipment loss or worse. But Parker ordered the opposite with a determination that bordered on obsession. Run the plant all night, no matter what. The weather was just another obstacle to overcome, another challenge that separated legends from ordinary miners. Chris had enough. The argument that followed would be remembered by every witness as the moment when years of accumulated tension finally exploded. He warned Parker to his face, not as an employee to a boss, but as one man to another. Fatigue would wreck trucks, loaders could flip on mud-slicked slopes, somebody could die in conditions where visibility was measured in feet and reaction time disappeared in the chaos. He wasn't exaggerating or being dramatic. A single wrong move on a slick Yukon slope could bury a man alive, crush him under machinery, or send him tumbling down a hillside into water cold enough to kill in minutes. Parker wouldn't budge, his jaw set in that familiar stubborn line that meant the discussion was over before it really began. Witnesses recall him shouting words that would haunt the camp for weeks. If you can't keep up, maybe you shouldn't be here. It was the ultimate dismissal, reducing 14 years of loyalty and sacrifice to a simple question of competence and commitment. That was the breaking point, the moment when something fundamental and irreparable shattered. Chris threw his gloves down in the mud with enough force to make nearby crew members flinch, turned his back on the plant he'd helped build and maintain through countless crises, and walked away mid-shift. For 14 years, fans had seen him tough out everything: frozen hoses that wouldn't flow, broken ribs that made every breath agony, 20-hour days that blurred together into one endless shift. But never this. For the first time in Gold Rush history, Chris Doumitt refused to dig for Parker Schnabel. The camp went silent except for the howling wind and the idle rumble of machinery. Trucks sat motionless, their drivers watching the scene unfold with the horrified fascination of people witnessing a car crash. The crew stood frozen, uncertain whether to support Chris, obey Parker, or simply disappear before they became collateral damage. And in that moment, the Yukon claim wasn't just a mine anymore. It was a battlefield where loyalty and ambition had finally gone to war. What followed in the days after that confrontation would fracture the crew in ways that no amount of gold could repair. Veteran crew members who'd seen it all before, machines breaking down, Parker setting impossible targets, long nights where exhaustion blurred into dawn, admitted this was different. When Chris walked away mid-shift, it left a crater in the camp's foundation. Around the fire at night, in the brief moments when exhaustion allowed for conversation, the whispers began circulating like a virus. Mitch and Brennan, who'd been with Parker for years and owed their careers to his operation, admitted to each other that Chris was right. The pace wasn't just grueling, it was unsustainable. Yet neither man dared voice it out loud in Parker's presence. Everyone knew his temper, had seen him fire miners on the spot for lesser transgressions. The threat of sudden dismissal hung in the air like a guillotine blade, visible to everyone and ignored by none. Other crew members, especially the newer hires who joined seeking the fame and fortune of Gold Rush television, chose silence as their survival strategy. They feared that siding with Chris meant career suicide, not just in Parker's camp, but across the entire Yukon mining community. Parker's influence was too wide, his connections too deep, his reputation too established. The young hands had families to feed back in the lower 48, debts to pay, mortgages that didn't care about workplace drama. They had no appetite for becoming collateral in a war of pride between two men they respected. Their silence wasn't loyalty to Parker. It was pure survival instinct in an industry where blacklisting was real and permanent. Lines were drawn almost overnight, invisible but undeniable. Team Parker and Team Doumitt became actual factions within the camp, though no one spoke those words aloud. At the campfire, you could tell where a man stood, just by which circle he sat in, who he made eye contact with, whose conversations he joined. On one side, the die-hard loyalists who believed Parker's vision was worth the grind, that greatness required sacrifice and discomfort was the price of legacy. On the other, those who quietly rallied around Chris's principles, the veteran miners who spoke of safety and reason when nobody else dared challenge the boss's increasingly aggressive demands. Conversations that used to be filled with stories, laughter, and Doumitt's cigar-fueled banter now turned into tense debates about who was right, and more importantly, who would survive the season with their job, health, and reputation intact. The camaraderie that had defined Parker's crew for years evaporated like morning frost under harsh sunlight, replaced by suspicion, resentment, and the constant calculation of survival odds. Morale didn't just decline, it tanked, plummeting to levels that threatened the entire operation's functionality. The energy that once drove the camp forward, that made men work through pain and exhaustion for the shared goal, turned heavy and sluggish. Repair jobs that should have taken hours dragged on for entire shifts because no one had the motivation to push through the problems. Trucks sat idle when they should have been hauling pay dirt, their drivers staring into space or finding excuses to avoid the cut, waiting for orders that no one wanted to carry out with any real conviction. Even the gold cleanouts, which should have been moments of triumph and celebration, felt hollow and performative. The pans glittered with ounces that represented weeks of back-breaking labor, but there were no cheers, no high fives, no spontaneous celebrations, just the mechanical documentation of numbers and the shadow of the rift spreading wider with every cleanup, poisoning what should have been the operation's proudest moments. The production crew felt it too, their cameras capturing a reality that Discovery hadn't planned for and didn't want. They started filming less during downtime, deliberately avoiding moments that might reveal how fractured the operation really was. Behind closed doors, in production trailers, where crew members thought they couldn't be overheard, producers whispered to each other about the situation, spiraling beyond their control. They needed conflict for ratings. That was the Gold Rush formula that had worked for years, but not conflict that threatened lawsuits, broken contracts, or the complete implosion of their flagship miners' operation. So when the inevitable explosion finally happened, when the simmering tensions finally boiled over into confrontation, the order came down quick and clear. Cameras off. What viewers would never see was the moment that truly ended the partnership that had defined Gold Rush for over a decade. The blowout came during a tense afternoon on site, the air thick with unsaid words and accumulated resentments. Accounts vary depending on who tells the story, but multiple insiders claim Chris had finally reached his absolute limit. He stormed into the cut, where Parker was supervising excavator operations, hard hat in hand, and slammed it into the mud at Parker's feet. The sound of impact cracked through the noise of machinery like a gunshot, sharp and final. The entire camp froze, every eye turning toward the two men who'd built an empire together and were now tearing it apart. Parker, caught off guard by the naked confrontation, didn't hold back the words he'd apparently been holding inside for weeks. "You're replaceable, Doumitt," he barked, his voice carrying across the site with enough force to reach every crew member within earshot. To Parker, it was a simple truth, born from hard experience. No man, no matter how loyal or talented, was bigger than the gold. The operation would continue, regardless of who was digging, driving, or managing. It was the logic of empire building, cold and absolute. But those words cut deeper than any blade forged in steel. For Chris, the confrontation had never been about ounces or production numbers or television ratings. It was about respect, about being valued as a human being rather than just another interchangeable part in Parker's machine. He fired back, with words that would become legend among those who heard them, his voice carrying across the site with the weight of 14 years of loyalty betrayed. "Not to the men, not to the fans, only to you." That exchange was pure dynamite, raw, unfiltered, and explosive in its honesty. But almost no one outside of that Yukon claim would ever witness it. Producers intervened immediately, ordering cameras down with an urgency that made clear this couldn't be part of the broadcast. They knew that airing a fight of that magnitude risked tarnishing the show's carefully constructed narrative, damaging reputations that the network had spent years building, and maybe even igniting legal trouble with broadcast standards or contractual violations. Officially, according to Discovery Channel's version of events, nothing happened that afternoon. Unofficially, among the crew and the hardcore fan community, it became legend. The lost footage, the scene too real for television. The moment when the facade of Gold Rush family cracked wide open. Within weeks, fan conspiracy theories erupted online, with Reddit threads and YouTube recap channels speculating endlessly about the forbidden episode, where Parker and Chris finally went head-to-head without cameras to sanitize or edit their words. What came next was somehow worse than any confrontation, a silence that was chilling, deliberate, and absolute. Chris's screen time dwindled almost overnight, as if an invisible hand had reached into the editing room and begun erasing him from existence. Once the centerpiece of Parker's crew, the man whose personality and humor had defined entire seasons, he was reduced to background shots where his face was barely visible, wide cuts where he was just another anonymous figure in coveralls, or moments so brief that longtime fans had to rewind episodes just to confirm they'd actually seen him. Parker, meanwhile, dominated the edit with an overwhelming presence that made clear whose story Discovery wanted to tell. His voiceovers shaped the season's narrative. His close-ups captured every emotional moment. His perspective became the lens through which viewers experienced the Yukon. It was as if the show wanted viewers to forget Chris was ever there, to rewrite history so that Parker's empire had always been a one-man show. Fans weren't fooled by the obvious manipulation. The absence was glaring, impossible to miss for anyone who'd watched Gold Rush for more than a season. The jokes, the cigars, the light-hearted wisdom that broke up the tension of long shifts and impossible targets, all of it gone without explanation or acknowledgement. Social media exploded with questions that grew more desperate and angry with each episode. Where's Doumitt? Why isn't he getting screen time? What happened to the heart of the crew? Every episode brought more theories, wilder speculation, and growing frustration with Discovery's refusal to address the elephant in the gold room. Some fans claimed he'd suffered a medical issue, forced to leave for health reasons that the network couldn't discuss. Others believed he'd retired quietly, finally succumbing to age and exhaustion after 14 brutal Yukon seasons. But the darker corners of the internet, the forums where crew leaks and insider information circulated like contraband, whispered the truth. There had been a clash, a blowout so severe that Discovery had chosen to bury it rather than risk the fallout. Parker did little to calm the storm of speculation and anger. In interviews, when pressed by journalists about crew changes and Chris's disappearance, he offered nothing more than vague one-liners that revealed nothing and confirmed everything. People come and go. It's the nature of mining. He never named Chris directly, never acknowledged the rift, never offered the clarity that fans desperately wanted. To some, that silence was confirmation enough that something had gone terribly wrong behind the scenes. Chris himself kept even quieter, his silence somehow louder than Parker's evasions. No interviews, no statements, no social media posts to set the record straight or share his side of the story. For a man known for his easygoing personality and openness with fans, his sudden withdrawal felt wrong, unnatural, like a piece of gold rush had simply been deleted from reality. Fans were left piecing together scraps of information, like amateur detectives, rumors from crew insiders. Fans shot photos from the Yukon that showed Chris still in the area but noticeably absent from Parker's operation. Whispered accounts that filtered into forums late at night from throwaway accounts claiming insider knowledge. The silence became louder than any shouting match could have been, filling the void with speculation that grew more elaborate and dramatic with each retelling. And in that silence, the legend of Doumitt versus Parker was born, not as a storyline Discovery wanted to air, but as a ghost haunting the very heart of Gold Rush, a reminder that some conflicts are too real, too raw, and too revealing to package as entertainment. The final rupture came down to something as old as mining itself, money and the value placed on human life versus ounces in the ground. After weeks of grueling, dangerous overtime shifts that pushed men past every reasonable limit, whispers began to leak from the crew that Chris Doumitt had demanded hazard pay for the extreme conditions. It wasn't greed driving the request, it was survival and basic fairness. Men were logging 18 to 20 hours a day, running trucks through storms that limited visibility to a few yards, patching machines in the dark with failing lights and numb fingers. Chris argued that if Parker was going to push men to their physical and mental limits, they deserved compensation that reflected the risk they were taking. The older miners, veterans of multiple Yukon seasons, quietly nodded in agreement. They'd seen too many accidents, too many men crippled or worse, because profit came before safety in the endless pursuit of ounces. But Parker saw things through a completely different lens. Every ounce of gold was already accounted for before it was even pulled from the ground, committed to equipment payments, fuel costs, investor returns, and the massive overhead of running a major mining operation. To him, hazard pay wasn't just unreasonable, it was economically impossible. The ground pays what it pays, he allegedly told the crew during a tense meeting. We don't get to add bonuses Because it's hard. To Parker, risk was part of the job description, built into mining itself. You signed up knowing that comfort and safety were luxuries the Yukon rarely offered. To Chris, it was the difference between respecting the men who made everything possible and exploiting them for ounces and television ratings. The standoff escalated beyond mere economics into a battle of fundamental principles. Chris wasn't just talking dollars and cents, he was talking about dignity, about valuing human life over mineral wealth. In front of several crew members who'd recount the moment for years afterward, he's remembered saying, "Gold's no good if the men don't live to spend it." It was a line that hung heavy in the cold Yukon air, a warning wrapped in plain truth that cut through all of Parker's justifications and rationalizations. Parker shot back with the bluntness only he could muster, the directness that had made him successful and isolated in equal measure. Without gold, there's no mine. Without the mine, none of us are here. The two men weren't just disagreeing about policy. They were speaking completely different languages, operating from worldviews that had no common ground. And that's when the feud transcended the personal and became ideological. This was profit versus people, ambition versus humanity, the eternal mining question of what actually mattered when you stripped away all the justifications and rationalizations. Parker Schnabel's vision of empire building, of legacy creation through sheer force of will and sacrifice, stood against Chris Doumitt's belief in loyalty, survival, and the idea that some things mattered more than ounces in a pan. The tragedy was amplified by their history, by everything Chris had meant to Parker's journey. For years, Chris had been Parker's anchor in rough waters, the steady hand that kept an ambitious teenager from capsizing under the weight of his own dreams. When Parker was just a green rookie, arrogant enough to think he could outdig legends like Tony Beats or Todd Hoffman, despite having a fraction of their experience, it was Chris who steadied him. He fixed broken machines with little more than scrap metal, ingenuity, and decades of accumulated knowledge. He kept morale up when seasons seemed lost, when equipment failures or poor ground threatened to sink the entire operation. Fans didn't just see Chris as a miner working for Parker. They saw him as Parker's second father, the man who balanced Parker's relentless ambition with humanity and wisdom. Without Chris's stabilizing presence, many believed Parker might never have become the biggest name in modern mining television. That's what made the split so devastating for everyone who'd watched their partnership evolve. For Chris, leaving meant breaking a decade-long legacy of loyalty, severing a bond that fans thought was unshakable, walking away from something he'd helped build from nothing into an empire. But his principles outweighed ounces and television fame. He wasn't going to sell out safety, fairness, or dignity just to hit a number on Discovery's highlight reel, just to feed Parker's insatiable hunger for records and recognition. For Parker, loyalty meant something entirely different, shaped by his youth and driving ambition. To him, being loyal meant sacrificing everything: time, comfort, relationships, even health, for the chance at gold and glory, at building something that would outlast any individual contribution. Anything less than total commitment wasn't loyalty in his eyes. It was weakness disguised as caution. The gulf between their definitions grew too wide to bridge with conversation or compromise, two worldviews that simply couldn't coexist. Outside of camp, the pressure on Parker was relentless and multifaceted. He wasn't just competing with Chris's conscience and the crew's complaints. He was competing with television ratings, Discovery's demands for escalating drama and production numbers, and the ever-present shadow of rivals like Tony Beats and Todd Hoffman, who'd love nothing more than to see the young upstart fail. Every headline, every ounce, every season had to prove that Parker Schnabel was still the undisputed king of the Klondike, still worthy of the spotlight and the investment. Loyalty to Parker was about standing with him in that fight, no matter how insane the odds, no matter what personal cost. Belongings that had made the camp feel like home, all of it loaded into the truck bed, like the final chapter of a story that everyone thought would have a different ending. The crew watched in silence as he prepared to leave, some wanting to speak, to stop him, to somehow fix what seemed irreparably broken. But fear and shock held them frozen, uncertain what words could possibly matter in a moment like this. Across the claim, Parker stood with arms folded, expression unreadable, behind sunglasses that hid whatever emotions might have been in his eyes. He didn't move forward, didn't call out, didn't make any gesture toward reconciliation or goodbye. He simply watched, silent and still as stone. It was the coldest ending imaginable for a partnership that had built years of history and defined Gold Rush for an entire generation of fans. And then, with the engine's growl cutting through the still Yukon air like a final goodbye, Chris drove away. Dust rose behind the truck as it rolled out of camp, the sound fading gradually into nothing as the distance grew. 14 years of loyalty, friendship, and shared dreams, gone in the time it takes for a truck to disappear over a hill. The crew was left stunned, standing in the silence like survivors of some terrible accident. Parker didn't flinch, his expression never changing. Chris didn't look back in the rearview mirror. And in that silence, an entire era of Gold Rush ended, not with the dramatic explosion fans might have expected, but with a fracture so deep and so quiet it would never heal. The aftermath hit the fan community like an earthquake. The moment episodes began to air without Chris Doumitt's trademark grin and cigar-smoking presence, without his jokes and wisdom that had defined the show's personality, the shockwave hit hard. Fans who had faithfully tuned in for over a decade erupted online with questions that quickly turned to anger and demands for answers. YouTube recaps, Facebook groups dedicated to Gold Rush, and Reddit threads were flooded with the same desperate refrain. Where's Doumitt? What happened to Chris? Why is Discovery pretending he never existed? Viewers who had once laughed at his one-liners and admired his unflappable grit felt personally cheated by his absence, as if a friend had vanished without explanation. Comment sections on official Gold Rush uploads turned into battlegrounds of speculation, accusation, and fierce debate. Some accused Parker Schnabel directly, labeling him the tyrant of the Klondike, a man so obsessed with gold totals and television fame that he'd crushed the very spirit of his crew. Others defended him fiercely, arguing that Parker's youth and driving ambition justified his tough leadership, that miners signed up, knowing it wasn't a job for the faint of heart or those who wanted comfortable schedules. The divide grew wider with each passing episode, each week of Chris's continued absence. Hashtags like #BringBackDoumitt trended periodically, and petitions calling for his return gained thousands of signatures on fan forums dedicated to Gold Rush discussion. Discovery Channel, however, stayed frustratingly silent. Instead of providing clarity or addressing the obvious question on every viewer's mind, they leaned into mystery, apparently calculating that speculation and controversy generated more engagement than honest answers. The network's refusal to acknowledge Chris's absence in any official capacity only fueled conspiracy theories, making fans more certain that something seismic and ugly had gone down off-camera. Leaks from ex-crew members soon painted an even darker picture, suggesting this wasn't just a personality clash or a simple parting of ways. It was a battle that stretched far beyond television drama. Whispered accounts that emerged on anonymous forums claimed Parker had threatened to blacklist Chris from Yukon contractors, ensuring he'd never work another major claim operation in the territory. For Parker, if these accounts were true, it was leverage designed to keep Doumitt from undermining him or competing directly. For Chris, it represented a line crossed, an attack on his livelihood and reputation that went far beyond any workplace dispute. Supposedly, Chris told Parker in no uncertain terms during one of their final confrontations, "I'll mind my way, with or without your cameras." Those words, if they were actually spoken, meant more than simple defiance. They signaled a miner who wasn't afraid to walk away from Discovery's empire and carve his own future, even if it meant starting over from nothing at an age when most men are thinking about retirement. But contracts with Discovery were reportedly ironclad, designed to protect the network's investment in personalities and storylines. Insiders claimed that legal agreements bound Chris in silence, preventing him from sitting for independent interviews, sharing his side of the story on social media, or even addressing fans directly, without risking expensive lawsuits that could destroy him financially. This contractual vacuum left only rumors to fill the void of official information. Whispers of a taped exit interview swirled among crew members and online investigators, footage that allegedly captured Chris's unfiltered truth about the split. But whether it was destroyed, locked away in Discovery's archives, or simply never meant to air, no one outside the production room could say for certain. Between documented fact, unverified rumors, and the network's calculated spin, the truth blurred into something nearly mythic. Fans became amateur investigators, combing episodes frame by frame for clues, analyzing background shots for glimpses of Chris, convinced that hidden edits or deliberately missing scenes pointed to the story Discovery desperately didn't want them to see. The absence of information became its own narrative, more compelling in some ways than any official explanation could have been. Chris Doumitt's departure became more than just a crew shakeup or a personnel change. It became legend, folklore, a cautionary tale about what happens when television and reality collide. It wasn't just the most shocking exit in Gold Rush history. It fundamentally reshaped the entire fan base's relationship with the show. To many viewers, Gold Rush was never the same afterward. Chris had been the soul of Parker's crew, the man who grounded Parker when ambition threatened to consume him completely. Without Chris's presence, many argued, the heart was gone, leaving only cold calculations of ounces and production numbers. Fans honored Chris's memory and contribution with tribute videos that garnered millions of views, montages of his best moments that reminded everyone what had been lost, and fan edits that digitally stitched his laughter and wisdom back into episodes where he'd been conspicuously absent. Nostalgia for the old days grew powerful, and Doumitt's absence turned into a permanent wound within the Gold Rush community, a reminder that the show they'd fallen in love with had fundamentally changed. Meanwhile, Parker hit his numbers. The season's ambitious targets were met through sheer force of will and relentless operation. Records were broken, gold stacked in impressive piles, and Discovery had its triumphant highlight reels showcasing a young miner who'd achieved what many said was impossible. But success came at a cost that no amount of gold could measure. For all the bars stacked in secure rooms, for all the ounces documented in cleanouts, many believed Parker had lost the one man who kept him tethered to his humanity, who reminded him that mining was about more than just numbers on a screen. The clash between Parker Schnabel and Doumitt became a cautionary tale that resonated far beyond Gold Rush fandom. A reminder that ambition, when unchecked by wisdom and compassion, could devour even the deepest bonds. Viewers didn't just see ounces pulled from the Yukon ground. They saw the human price paid in fractured loyalty, broken friendships, and silence that spoke louder than any confession. The Yukon continued its work, indifferent to human battles and the drama that played out on its frozen surface. Machines still roared across the claims, their diesel engines cutting through the Arctic air. Trucks still rumbled along haul roads, carrying tons of pay dirt toward processing plants. Wash plants still spilled glittering gold dust across recovery mats, creating the wealth that justified all the sacrifice. The land didn't care about loyalty or betrayal, about friendship or ambition. It simply held its treasures and surrendered them to whoever was willing to dig deep enough. But the bond between Parker Schnabel and Doumitt, a partnership that once symbolized everything Gold Rush represented, grit, loyalty, and the delicate balance between heart and ambition, was shattered beyond any possibility of repair. The cameras captured ounces and production numbers, documented record-breaking seasons and impressive achievements, yet they couldn't capture what was truly lost when Chris's truck disappeared over that hill, leaving nothing but dust and silence in its wake. In its place remained a legacy far more complex than any simple story of success or failure, questions that would never be fully answered, theories that would continue to evolve and multiply in fan communities, and the quiet, enduring legend of the man fans still call the heart of Gold Rush. A reminder that some things matter more than gold, and some losses can't be measured in ounces or dollars. The clash didn't just end a partnership, it ended an era, leaving behind only memories, speculation, and the haunting knowledge that even the strongest bonds can break when ambition and principle finally go to war.